The hands moved with a patience that seemed older than the stone they worked. A slow and rhythmic grinding of brittle leaves and dried roots into a fine, fragrant dust. A pestle, worn smooth and dark by countless turns in a heavy mortar, rose and fell, crushing the life from one form so it might be given to another, and the sound was the only sound in the small, dim room, a whisper of stone on stone that did nothing to disturb the heavy, hanging silence of the afternoon. Outside, the sun baked the single dirt street of the town of Redemption until it cracked like old pottery, and the heat was a physical weight that pressed down on the plank storefronts and settled in the lungs. But here, behind a drawn burlap curtain, it was cool and still, a place outside of time. The man, whose name was Wei, worked without hurry, his focus narrowed to the pale green powder collecting in the bowl, his face a map of places left behind and hardships endured, etched not with bitterness but with a profound and immovable calm. He had been in this place for 3 years, a quiet fixture at the edge of town where the settled world frayed into open scrubland, a presence tolerated for his utility but never truly seen, like a familiar tool whose origins no one bothered to question. His world was this room, the scent of ginseng and licorice root, the neat rows of ceramic jars on his shelves, and the small stubborn garden out back where he coaxed life from the unforgiving soil. He was a healer, he was an outsider. In Redemption, these were often the same thing. That night, a knock came at his door, soft and hesitant, a sound so unusual it seemed to stir the very motes of dust in the still air. Wei paused, his hand hovering over a simmering pot, the steam carrying the earthy scent of boiled bark through the room. He did not call out but moved to the door with the same deliberate quiet that defined all his actions, his bare feet making no sound on the packed earth floor. He drew back the simple wooden bolt and opened the door a few inches, enough to see the shape of a man standing in the faint moonlight, his form made bulky by the star pinned to his vest. It was the sheriff, a man named Brody, his face pale and drawn in the low light, his hat held crushed in both hands. The sheriff's gaze darted past Wei into the dim interior, then back, his throat working for a moment before any words came. "They say you have skills," Brody said, the words clipped, tasting of desperation and shame. Wei did not answer immediately, his own gaze steady, unreadable. He simply waited, letting the man's need fill the space between them until it was a tangible thing. The sheriff's daughter, Ilara, had been wasting away for months, with a fever the town doctor could not name and a weakness that had stolen the light from her eyes, a slow-motion vanishing that had hollowed out the lawman from the inside. Everyone knew, no one spoke of it. "The doctor, he's done all he can," Brody finally managed, his voice rough. "He says it's God's will now." Wei considered the man before him, the rigid posture of his pride fighting a losing battle with the slump of his fear. He had seen this look many times, on many faces, in many towns. It was the look of a man who had run out of options and had come to a place he swore he never would. Wei's eyes, dark and ancient, held no judgment, only a deep and weary understanding of the world's pain. He opened the door wider. "Bring her," he said. It was not a question. It was a simple instruction. The sheriff nodded, a sharp, jerky motion, and turned away into the darkness without another word. A debt had been offered, not of money, but of hope. Wei closed the door and returned to his simmering pot, the quiet rhythm of his work resuming as if it had never been broken. The girl was a ghost, a fragile collection of bones wrapped in pale skin, her breath a shallow whisper in the heavy silence of the room. Sheriff Brody carried her in his arms as if she were made of glass, his movements clumsy with a fear of breaking what was already broken, and laid her gently on the simple cot Wei had prepared. Ilara's eyes were open but saw nothing, clouded by the fever that had held her captive for so long, and a fine tremor ran constantly through her thin limbs. Wei stood over her, not touching, simply observing, his attention so complete it was like a physical touch, his gaze taking in the faint blue tint of her nails, the dry, cracked texture of her lips, the almost imperceptible flutter of her pulse at the base of her throat. He spent a long time just looking, his stillness a counterpoint to the sheriff's restless pacing, the scrape of his boots on the floor a sound of grating anxiety. Finally, Wei turned and began to move through his small apothecary, his hands selecting jars and packets with an unhurried certainty. He measured powders, steeped leaves in hot water until the room filled with a complex, bitter steam, and ground a dark paste in his mortar. He worked without explanation, his every action precise and deliberate, a ritual of healing that was as old as the mountains he came from. The sheriff watched, his initial suspicion warring with a desperate, burgeoning hope. He had seen the town doctor shake his head, had heard the sympathetic murmurs of the church ladies, had felt the finality in their averted eyes. This was different. This was not surrender. This was work. We brought a small, warm cup to the girl's lips, tilting it carefully, and a few drops of the dark, steaming liquid passed between them. He spoke to her in a low, soft tone, not in English, but in the language of his homeland, the syllables like smooth stones in a flowing river. Then he unwrapped a small cloth bundle to reveal a series of impossibly thin silver needles. The sheriff took a sharp step forward, his hand instinctively going to the colt at his hip. "What is that?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. Wei paused and looked at him, his expression unchanged. "A current," he said simply, his English careful and spare, "to remind the river how to flow." He turned back to Alara, his touch impossibly gentle as he found a place on her wrist, and with a slight, practiced twist, he slid the first needle into her skin. The girl did not flinch. A long, slow breath escaped her lips, the first deep breath the sheriff had heard her take in a month. He froze. He watched as Wei placed another needle and another, creating a delicate silver pattern on her skin, his hands moving with the grace of a master craftsman. He was not just treating an illness. He was mending a life, thread by delicate thread. Days bled into weeks, a slow turning of the calendar marked by the rising and setting of a relentless sun. Every morning and every evening, the sheriff would carry his daughter to the small house at the edge of town, a silent procession that the people of redemption watched from behind their curtains and from the doorways of their shops. They did not approve, their silence a thick blanket of judgment, their faces hard and closed when Brody passed. He was the law, but he was consorting with a man they did not understand, a man whose ways were not their ways, and in their fear, they saw betrayal. Yet the sheriff continued, his jaw set, his eyes fixed forward, because he had seen what they had not. He had seen the fever begin to recede from his daughter's eyes, not all at once, but like a slow tide going out, leaving behind clearer and clearer ground each day. He had seen the tremors in her hands lessen until she could hold a cup of Wei's bitter tea herself, her grip still weak but her own. He had seen the color return to her cheeks, a faint blush of rose on pale porcelain. Wei never spoke of progress, never offered words of hope or reassurance. His work was his only language. He would change the herbs in her tea, adjust the placement of the needles, and prepare poultices that smelled of damp earth and crushed mint, his attention always absolute, his calm a steadying anchor in the sheriff's storm of anxiety. One afternoon, as Wei was removing the needles from Alara's arm, she spoke, her voice thin but clear. "It doesn't hurt," she said, looking at the tiny red marks left on her skin. Wei nodded, carefully wiping each needle before placing it back in its silk-lined box. "It is not meant to hurt," he replied. "It is meant to wake." Later that week, she took her first steps, from the cot to the door, her father's hands hovering near her, ready to catch her, but she did not fall. She walked. It was a short, shuffling journey, but it was a journey forward, away from the bed that had been her prison. The sheriff's eyes burned with unshed tears as he watched her, a raw and painful gratitude lodging itself deep in his chest, a feeling so immense it had no words. He looked at Wei, who was sweeping the floor as if nothing remarkable had happened at all, and he understood that this quiet, solitary man had given him back his world, not with a miracle, but with patience, with knowledge, and with the steady, unassuming courage to simply do the work. Then the railroad came. It arrived not as a slow approach, but as a sudden, clamorous invasion, a crew of 24 men who descended on the town with the force of a flash flood, bringing with them the noise of iron and steam, the smell of sweat and cheap whiskey, and a raw, restless energy that shattered redemption's sleepy quiet. They were there to lay a new spur line, a vein of steel that would connect the town to the main artery of commerce and change it forever. And they carried themselves with the casual arrogance of men who knew they were the agents of an unstoppable future. Their leader was a foreman named Cole, a man with a face like rough-hewn granite and eyes the color of a winter sky, cold and empty of warmth. He moved with an economy of motion, his authority absolute and unspoken, his presence casting a long shadow over the dusty street. Cole and his men saw the town not as a community of people, but as a temporary camp, a resource to be used and discarded. They took over the saloon, their loud talk and rough laughter spilling into the night, and their gaze fell upon the townspeople with a mixture of contempt and predatory assessment. And they saw Wei. They saw him on one of his trips to the dry hills to gather herbs, a small solitary figure moving through the scrubland, and they saw him as something less than a man, a piece of the landscape, or worse, an object of sport. They called out to him, their words sharp and mocking, but Wei did not turn, his pace never faltering, his focus on the task at hand. This refusal to engage, this quiet dignity, only seemed to sharpen their cruelty. It was a challenge they could not understand and therefore could not tolerate. One day, one of Cole's men, a big, lumbering man named Harker, cornered Wei in the alley beside the general store, blocking his path. "Hey, Chinaman," Harker sneered, his breath sour with liquor. "Cole wants to see you." It was a summons, not a request. Wei looked at the man, his expression calm, his body still. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod and followed Harker toward the makeshift camp the railroad crew had set up near the edge of town, the sounds of hammering steel growing louder with every step. Cole was standing over a set of blueprints laid out on a crate, a cigarillo clenched between his teeth. He didn't look up as Wei approached. He gestured with his chin toward a man lying on a cot nearby, his leg wrapped in a blood-soaked rag. "He got careless," Cole said, his voice flat, transactional. "Fix it." He was not asking for a healer's skill. He was requisitioning a tool. He had heard the whispers about the sheriff's daughter, about the Chinaman's strange medicine, and he saw it only in terms of its use to him. Wei looked from Cole to the injured man, whose face was slick with sweat and pale with pain. There was no hesitation. He knelt by the cot, his hands moving with their familiar steady competence as he unwrapped the crude bandage to assess the deep, ragged gash beneath. He sent one of the other men for clean water and cloths, his low voice holding an authority that surprised them into obedience. He cleaned the wound, stitched it with a neatness that was almost beautiful, and applied a thick, dark poultice from a small tin he carried in his pocket. He worked in silence, his focus absolute, immune to the hostile eyes of the crew surrounding him. When he was finished, he stood and looked at Cole. "Keep it clean," he said. "Change the dressing in the morning." Cole took a drag from his cigarillo, smoke curling from his lips as he looked Wei up and down, a cold, calculating appraisal. He reached into his pocket and tossed a silver dollar onto the ground near Wei's feet. It glittered in the dust. "Don't spend it all in one place," he said, a smirk playing on his lips. The other men chuckled. Wei looked at the coin, then back at Cole's hard face. He did not bend to pick it up. He simply turned and walked away, his back straight, leaving the coin to be swallowed by the dirt. He had done the work not because he was ordered to, and not for payment, but because it was the work that was needed. Cole watched him go, the smirk fading from his face, replaced by a flicker of something else. Annoyance. He was not accustomed to being dismissed. The quiet man had refused to play his part in the transaction, and in doing so had claimed a power Cole hadn't offered him. The tension in the town grew taut, like a wire stretched to its breaking point. The oppressive summer heat seemed to trap the animosity, letting it fester in the still, dusty air. Cole and his men moved through redemption with an increasing swagger, their casual cruelty escalating from mocking words to small acts of vandalism and intimidation, their presence a constant, grating friction against the town's established rhythms. Their primary target was Wei. They saw his quiet refusal to be intimidated not as strength but as an insult, a stubbornness that needed to be broken. They kicked over the buckets he used to water his garden, threw stones at his door in the middle of the night, and spoke of him in loud, degrading terms in the saloon, knowing their words would carry. The townspeople, caught between the disruptive force of the railroad and their own lingering prejudice, did nothing. They averted their eyes, they locked their doors, they offered Wei no comfort and no aid, their silence a form of complicity. Sheriff Brody felt the pressure from all sides. Men who had once clapped him on the shoulder now gave him curt nods. The town council urged him to keep the peace, which was their coded way of telling him not to provoke the railroad, not to defend the outsider. But every day he saw his daughter, Alara, growing stronger, the light fully returned to her eyes, her laughter a sound he had thought he would never hear again. She spent her afternoons at Wei's small house, not as a patient anymore, but as a student of sorts, helping him tend his garden, learning the names of the herbs, her hands, once trembling and weak, now steady as she sorted dried leaves. He saw the quiet, respectful bond that had formed between the young woman and the old man, a connection built on a foundation of shared vulnerability and earned trust. And he knew he was indebted to Wei in a way that no amount of town pressure could erase. The conflict came to a head over a patch of dirt. Cole, consulting his blueprints, declared that the most efficient path for the new spur line ran directly through the plot of land behind Wei's house. It ran directly through his garden. The garden was everything to Wei. It was his pharmacy, his sanctuary, the place where he cultivated not just herbs but a small measure of peace in a hostile world. When Brody delivered the news, his face grim, Wei received it with his usual stillness, but the sheriff saw something shift in the old man's eyes, a hardening, a drawing inward. "The company will compensate you for the land," Brody said, the words feeling hollow and false even as he spoke them. Wei looked out his back window at the neat rows of green shoots, at the delicate tendrils of a climbing melon vine, at the small, resilient patch of life he had coaxed from the dust. He had spent 3 years tending that soil. It was not a thing that could be compensated for with money. "This is my place," he said, his voice quiet but unyielding. The next morning, Cole arrived with a team of men carrying shovels and axes. He found Wei standing at the edge of his garden, his arms crossed, his body positioned between the crew and the first row of plants. He was not armed, he was not shouting, he was simply there, a stone in the path. Cole stopped a few feet away, a look of amused disbelief on his face. "Get out of the way, old man," he said, his voice deceptively calm. "We have work to do." Wei did not move. He did not speak. He just stood his ground, his presence a silent, absolute refusal. Cole's amusement curdled into irritation. He was a man accustomed to obstacles being things he could blast through or tear down, and the quiet, immovable presence of this one old man was an infuriating anomaly. "I'm not going to tell you again," Cole said, his voice dropping, the politeness fraying to reveal the cold menace beneath. His men fanned out behind him, their hands gripping their tools a little tighter, the jangle of metal and the scrape of boots on dry earth the only sounds. The sun beat down, bleaching the color from the sky. A small crowd of townspeople had gathered at a safe distance, drawn by the confrontation, their faces blank, their bodies still. They were watchers, a silent chorus waiting to see how this would end. Sheriff Brody stood on the porch of Wei's small house just behind him, his hand resting on the worn grip of his pistol, the weight of it both a comfort and a burden. He could feel the town's eyes on him, could feel their unspoken demand for him to restore order, to remove the disruption. But the disruption was not the old man standing in defense of his small patch of life. The disruption was the foreman and his crew, who saw the world as something to be flattened and paved over. From inside the house, Alara watched through the open door, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She saw Wei, who had faced her own near-death with such profound calm, now facing a different kind of threat with that same unshakable stillness. She saw her father, caught between his badge and his conscience. Cole took a step closer, his shadow falling over Wei. "This land belongs to the railroad now," he said, his voice low and hard. "You are trespassing." He gestured to 2 of his biggest men. "Move him." The 2 men started forward, their faces set in grim lines of duty. They were not cruel by nature, perhaps, but they were men who followed orders, who did what was necessary to earn their pay and move on to the next town, the next job. This was just another part of the work. Wei did not look at them. His gaze remained fixed on Cole, a deep, steady look that held no fear, only a quiet and profound certainty. Just as the men reached for him, a clear voice cut through the tense silence. "Stop." It was Alara. She stepped out of the house and stood beside Wei, placing a hand on his arm. She was no longer the frail ghost the town remembered. She was slender, yes, but she stood tall, her chin up, her eyes clear and fierce. She looked directly at Cole, her gaze as unwavering as Wei's. The foreman's eyes flickered to her, a brief moment of surprise, before his face hardened into a dismissive sneer. "Get the girl out of here, Sheriff," he said, not looking at Brody but keeping his eyes on Wei, as if Alara were nothing more than a minor annoyance. But the sheriff did not move. He saw his daughter, standing in defense of the man who had saved her, and in that moment, the choice he had been struggling with became simple. It was no longer about the town, or the railroad, or the law. It was about what was right. It was about a debt that had to be paid. Wei looked down at the girl's hand on his arm. Then he lifted his head and looked past Cole, to the sheriff on the porch. He did not ask for help. He did not need to. His eyes simply held the sheriff's, a silent question passing between them. What kind of man are you? What is this place, this redemption, if not this? And in that weighted silence, the turning point of it all arrived not with a shout, but with a quiet statement. He is not finished, Wei said, his voice calm, directed at the sheriff but meant for all to hear. The garden is not finished. The words hung in the hot, still air, simple and profound. The garden is not finished. It was a statement about more than just plants and soil. It was a declaration of purpose, a refusal to be erased, a claim to a future, however small. Cole scoffed, a short, ugly sound of contempt. It's finished now, he said, and nodded to his men. Get them both out of the way. But before his men could take another step, Sheriff Brody moved. He walked down the 2 steps of the porch and came to stand on the other side of Wei, creating a line of 3. The old healer, the young woman he had saved, and the lawman who owed him everything. Brody's hand never left his pistol, but he didn't draw it. His power in that moment came not from the threat of violence, but from the quiet solidity of his presence. He was no longer a man torn. He was a man who had chosen his ground. That's enough, Cole, the sheriff said, his voice even and steady. This is his land. You'll find another way. Cole stared at him, his expression a mask of disbelief. He had assessed Brody as a weak man, a small-town lawman who would buckle under the immense pressure of the railroad's money and influence. He had made a transactional calculation, and he had gotten it wrong. He had not factored in the variable of gratitude. He had not understood the weight of a daughter's life. You're making a mistake, Sheriff, Cole said, his voice dropping to a low, threatening hum. The company won't forget this. This town needs this railroad. I expect it does, Brody replied, his gaze unwavering. But not like this, not today. He looked from Cole to the crew, then to the silent townspeople watching from the periphery. Go on now, get back to your work, elsewhere. The foreman and the sheriff held each other's gaze for a long moment. A silent battle of wills played out under the harsh glare of the sun. Cole's men looked from their boss to the sheriff, uncertainty flickering on their faces. They were paid to lay track, not to fight the local law over a vegetable patch. The calculation in Cole's eyes was visible. To force the issue would mean a direct confrontation, arrests, delays. It would mean a report sent back to his superiors explaining why his crew was behind schedule because of a dispute with a small-town sheriff over a Chinese gardener. His power was transactional, and suddenly the cost of this transaction was too high. The cold logic of his cruelty dictated a retreat. With a final look of pure, undiluted hatred at Wei, Cole turned. Pack it up, he spat at his men. We'll go around. He strode away without a backward glance, his crew following in his wake, the tools suddenly seeming less like weapons and more like simple implements of labor again. The threat dissolved, not with a bang, but with the quiet, shuffling sound of men walking away. The gathered townspeople stirred, murmuring amongst themselves, and began to disperse, their faces a mixture of relief and confusion. They had witnessed something they didn't fully understand, a victory of quiet stubbornness over loud aggression. The silence that fell over the garden was different now. It was not a silence of tension, but of peace, an earned peace. Weeks later, the heat of summer finally broke, giving way to the cool, clear air of early autumn. The railroad spur was completed, its path diverted in a wide, awkward curve around Wei's small property, a permanent, visible scar on the landscape that told a story of quiet defiance. The construction crew, their work done, had moved on, and the town of Redemption settled back into a silence that was deeper and more thoughtful than before. The daily procession to Wei's house had ended, but Alara was still a frequent visitor. She did not come for healing anymore, but for companionship, and for the lessons the garden had to teach. She moved among the rows of herbs with a newfound grace, her hands now sure and knowledgeable as she helped Wei harvest the last of the season's bounty. She had learned the rhythm of the work, the patience it required, the deep satisfaction of nurturing life from the soil. The light had not just returned to her eyes, it now shone from within, a quiet confidence that had been forged in sickness and tempered by loyalty. Sheriff Brody would often watch them from a distance, seeing his daughter not as the fragile girl he had almost lost, but as the strong young woman she had become. He would see her laughing as Wei showed her how to tie up the stalks of a flowering herb, and a feeling of profound, aching gratitude would wash over him. His debt to the old healer was a living thing, a debt he was glad he would never be able to fully repay. The townspeople's attitudes had shifted too. The change was not spoken, but it was felt. The averted eyes were now met with quiet nods of respect. The hard, closed faces had softened. When Wei walked to the general store, a path was cleared for him, not out of fear, but out of a grudging deference. They had seen his stillness in the face of Cole's aggression. They had seen the sheriff, their sheriff, stand with him, and they had seen Alara, healthy and whole, a living testament to the old man's skill. They still did not understand his ways, but they had come to respect his character. He was no longer just the outsider, the Chinaman at the edge of town. He was Wei. He was the man who had healed the sheriff's daughter. He was the man who had faced down the railroad and won, not with a gun, but with a quiet, unshakable sense of his own worth. One afternoon, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the garden, Brody walked over to where Wei and Alara were working. He didn't say anything for a long time, just stood there, watching them pack dried leaves into small cloth bags. Finally, he cleared his throat. Wei looked up, his face calm in the golden light. "The garden," Brody said, his voice a little rough. "It looks good." Wei nodded, a small, slow movement of his head. He looked at the rich soil, at the healthy plants, at the young woman beside him, her face glowing with life. "Yes," he said, a rare, small smile touching the corners of his mouth. "It is good work." And in that simple exchange, everything was understood. The debt, the gratitude, the respect. An order had been restored in redemption, but it was a new order, one built not on suspicion and fear, but on a quiet, hard-won dignity. The ground had been healed, and so had the people who lived on it. Strength is not always a shout. It is not always a fist or a sword or the force of an engine that can move mountains. Sometimes true strength is the quietest thing in the room. It is the patience to grind herbs day after day, believing in the power of the earth. It is the courage to stand on a small patch of dirt and say no without raising your voice, to claim your place in the world simply by refusing to be moved from it. It is the stillness that meets aggression, not with more aggression, but with a calm so profound it becomes a shield. Wei did not seek a confrontation. He sought only to live, to heal, to tend his garden. But when the world tried to pave over his small measure of peace, he showed a resilience that was stronger than steel. He reminded a town and a sheriff and a young woman who had forgotten that dignity is not something that can be given or taken away by others. It is a seed you cultivate within yourself, in the quiet garden of your own soul. He proved that you do not have to be loud to be heard, and you do not have to be violent to be powerful. Sometimes the most revolutionary act is to simply stand your ground and continue to do the good work that is yours to do. The world is full of noise, full of men like Cole who believe that power is the ability to dominate, to take, to erase. But the world is also sustained by the quiet ones, by the healers, the gardeners, the keepers of ancient knowledge who understand that true power lies in the ability to mend, to nurture, and to endure. We have been so honored to share this story with you. Thank you for spending your time with us, for listening with an open heart. We have to ask, what does quiet strength look like in your life? Who is the person who taught you that resilience doesn't always roar? We would love to read your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories and your reflections are what make this community so special. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this one, stories that search for the light in the shadows, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. It means the world to us and allows us to continue bringing these narratives to you. Until next time, be well and tend to your own garden.